Good morning, everyone. We'll just allow a couple of minutes to let everyone come onto the call. I can see there are still people joining, so we'll just wait a moment. Okay, looks like the numbers are settling, so let's make a start. For those that don't know me, I'm Rebecca Bailey. I'm the Programme Director for Towards the National Collection. And today's event is the first in a series of webinars where our first round of funded projects, our foundation projects, share their interim findings. Some of you may have already discovered their published reports. If not, you can find them via our website. And I would have to say it's been an extremely interesting year for our foundation projects. I suspect you might get a little flavour of this in their presentations. Obviously a huge challenging year for absolutely everyone, and our project started just a few weeks before lockdown. So they've had a very interesting time achieving their research objectives at such a challenging time. I would have to say they've been fantastically resilient and flexible, have coped beautifully, and what you're going to hear today is what they've managed to achieve and possibly a little bit on what they're doing next. So we've got two presentations this morning. The first on persistent identifiers as IRO infrastructure, and that's Rachael Kotarski, PI, speaking. Colin just took the screen down, but happily I know that the second presentation is locating a national collection led by Gethin Rees. We are live streaming today, so in addition to the people on the Zoom call, we have a live stream audience on YouTube. Everyone on the Zoom call can ask questions by using the chat box. Don't bother typing out your whole question, just stick a Q in the chat box. Send it to everyone, I'll monitor that, and when we come to the Q&A after both presentations, they'll call upon you to ask your own questions. If you're watching the live stream, you can also register questions, but Colin will have to send them through to me on the chat, and we won't be able to invite you to ask them in person, so you'll need to actually write down what your questions are. So we're going to have both presentations first and then a Q&A at the end, so you can ask questions to both projects or to individual ones as you see fit. Colin, have I covered all technical requirements of the day?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, so usual format, once we get going, feel free to put your camera off. You're all automatically muted. If we invite you to ask a question, you'll be able to unmute. So I'm going to hand over to Rachael, who's going to give us the first presentation.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yes, hello everyone. I'm Rachael Kotarski. I'm the Head of Research Infrastructure Services at the British Library, and I am the PI for the Persistent Identifiers as IRO Infrastructure project. That's a bit of a mouthful, so unofficially we are called Heritage PIDs, PID being the Persistent Identifier part. It's going to be just me presenting, but we do have a number of partners on the project, some of which I think are in the room, and I'll get to those in just a second. So I'm going to give you a background to what the project is about and what persistent identifiers are, if you're not already familiar with them, what we've achieved 1 year into the project, a quick introduction to our findings, the recommendations that we had from that, and just very quickly some next steps at the end. So being based at the British Library, I'm leading the project. We also have a research associate on the project, Frances Madden, who's based with me at the British Library. We have co-eyes Lorna Mitchell from the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, Joe Padfield at National Gallery, who will also be speaking about the IIIF project, I think, at some point in one of these future ones, and Rod Page at the University of Glasgow. We also have other organisations that we're working quite closely with within the project. That's the V&A Science Museum Group and Natural History Museum. And across, this relatively small number of partners, we do cover a wide variety of collection types. So from archives to art, specimens, biological collections, library collections, contemporary research. But the one thing that we do definitely have in common is an interest in seeing how we can use persistent identifiers to support the work that we do, connect and link our connections across our institutional boundaries, and use them potentially for management processes as well. So what are persistent identifiers? So persistent identifiers are specifically IDs that you can give to an object that provide a stable and long-lived link to that object, or potentially information about it, especially if it's a physical object. I've included two examples on this slide. So the first one you might be vaguely familiar with, that is a digital object identifier. You will commonly see these to identify research articles. They have been used for that since around the year 2000, so a good 2 decades now, and increasingly being used across all kinds of research output types, so from code and software to presentations to data sets. The second identifier you'll see there is an international standard name identifier. So this has been put in place primarily by a number of national libraries to help disambiguate copyright holders. So that's authors who are individuals, organizations. And while, as you see them right now, they are just an ID like you might see any other ID or accession number, a key feature of these is that if you add a little bit of URL to the beginning, they become an actual link to an item. So when we talk about persistent identifiers in the project, we are talking about identifiers that have 3 very specific features. That is that they are actionable. So as I've shown previously, you can put them in a URL and it means you can actually click on it to retrieve or access an item or information about it. That this is globally unique. So no matter what organization is creating an identifier, wherever they sit in the world, there is no chance of it clashing with another identifier that someone else might be creating elsewhere for their own content. And that both of these features are persisted for the long term. So they are guaranteed to remain clickable and to remain globally unique. And that is underwritten by either technology management or specific governance that allows that to be the case. And so these 3 specific features of the persistent identifiers we're talking about allow us to do very specific things that may be unactionable and only locally unique and unpersisted identifiers can't do. They allow us to support citation of the materials that are used. So if someone is using one of our collection items and they cite it in the way they would cite a paper or a book, then we actually know that they've used it and we can trace that wherever it happens to be lurking on the internet. It enables linked data. And also these kinds of identifiers, there is a common understanding of them, especially within research infrastructure and across researchers. And that really helps us to kind of embed the work we do within more closely within research workflows. and I've mentioned metrics, so I will skip on from that. I think the main thing and the reason that we feel that these features of persistent identifiers are important towards the national collection is that they now allow us to create links between specific pieces of data and information, each within our individual silos. And once we create those connections, that's how we start to break down the barriers and actually really build a national network collection. So with that in mind, these were the aims that we set out with for the Heritage PIDs work. What we wanted to do was increase the use of persistent identifiers across the sector to actually take advantage of the use of persistent identifiers for things like citation, for linking information across our institutional silos, and the other kind of benefits they offer in terms of things like metrics. And we hope to do this by providing the sector with the tools essentially to get us started on the path to the use and implementation of persistent identifiers, including the selection of which identifiers are actually appropriate for the kinds of activities that the sector engages in. So 1 year in, all projects started January, February last year. Little did we know what was just a couple of months down the road. We had one very early workshop planned within the project for April. And obviously with lockdown 1 happening just a few weeks before that, we were actually lucky in the sense that being a primarily digital project, we were able to just say, let's just put this workshop online. I think that sometimes it might feel that you don't necessarily get the two-way dialogue that you might have when you sit people in a room, but actually the way that we held these online meant that we had much broader engagement with the heritage sector far beyond the scope of the UK. So we had attendees within our first workshop from across Europe and the US, but we also had attendees from the Middle East, Asia, and even Australia. I do not know what time they stayed up to sit in on our session, but I think that was quite an important thing for us to see in the fact that heritage organisations globally are looking at how they can make better use of persistent identifiers, and there's a real interest in hearing more about the work that we're doing within the project. So we had our 2 workshops, which have really kind of opened up the dialogue, but one of the early things that we also did was perform a survey of the heritage sector, and some of you will have seen and hopefully filled in the survey that we had. This was really benchmarking at the start of the project so that we could understand what the current state of awareness and use of persistent identifiers really was to kind of challenge our assumptions, and I'll come on to that in just a second. We had planned, and we've currently performed 2 case studies of partners within the project. So we have a case study in the British Library and the National Gallery's current use and implementations of persistent identifiers. Really a discussion of how we've got to where we are now so that other organisations can take those examples and think that, oh, well, you know, we're not as far behind in use of persistent identifiers as we thought we were, but also what are the questions we need to ask ourselves to begin implementation. We have a demonstrator, so Rod Page as a co-I put together a demonstrator of what tools could be enabled if you have persistent identifiers on heritage collections, and how you can then use those to link the collections into published research. The second workshop, so the second DOI link on the workshop's bullet point, includes a video of Rod putting that towards its paces, so I encourage anyone to have a look at that because it's really good work done in quite a short space of time. We have a few mini case studies, so looking at very specific topics and questions around the use of persistent identifiers in various heritage contexts, and we will continue to add to those mini case studies and pop them on the website via the blog. And as Rebecca already mentioned, we have our early findings. So we wanted to get out early findings from the survey, our literature review, and our case studies pretty sharpish. So we released those in October, I'm sure it was October, and that really goes a bit more in depth into the findings and the recommendations that I'm presenting to you today. And then we have the interim report, which covers a little bit more of the admin and how we've been doing as a project over the past year, and that's available from the programme website. So that's a bit of where we're up to, and I guess the main meat of what I'm talking to you about today is the findings and the recommendations that we have from the project so far. So I mentioned the survey that we had run across the heritage sector in the UK. We did ask people outside the UK to fill that out if they wanted to, but we didn't have enough of an uptake of that to really pull any concrete conclusions from it. So the findings that I'm presenting today are really very much focused on the UK. We do understand that, you know, as a project, we've been lucky that we haven't had staff on furlough. We were able to recruit into our research associate role quite quickly, and not all the other projects have been that lucky. But also because of the furlough situation during the period that we were running the survey, we left it open for as long as we could, to be able to get a reasonable snapshot of awareness and understanding of persistent identifiers in the sector. But obviously it won't have had as much traction as it would have done if everyone had been kind of working normally, as it were. So there are a few kind of caveats that go along with the data. But generally what we did find is that it appears that awareness of identifiers is not the barrier to adoption we thought it might be within the sector. And it's actually more that the in-depth perception of which persistent identifiers allow specific benefits might be more of the issue. So, you know, this in-depth knowledge might highlight also where people are talking about identifiers that might not necessarily match the kind of the three facets of being actionable, globally unique and persistent, but they are still useful to some of the activities that organizations need to carry out day to day, and may still enable us to be able to link information across organizations. So we need to kind of consider that and the benefits of moving us along to what we might call kind of gold standard persistent identifiers as part of that conversation. So not awareness of the identifiers themselves per se, but actually about the benefits and the cost benefit analysis. Sorry. So we also need to make sure that that's articulated not just at the kind of the level of the people who might be working with persistent identifiers day to day, but there was definitely a call to be able to articulate that value to decision makers as well. So that has become a kind of a bit of a focus of the work ongoing about who our audience is for materials that we produce as part of the project. We do need something that also people can put in front of those who either hold the purse strings or have the power to make institutional decisions going forward. And as much as persistent identifiers will do that piece of, you know, externally allowing us to link our collections together, link our data together, link our collections in with the research context, what we found from the case studies is that the drivers for existing implementations that there are, so obviously, you know, we have a focus on what we've done at the British Library and at the National Gallery, but existing implementations, the impetus for those has very much been internal use cases and not the kind of external environment and the external linking. And this is again where we see that there will be some types of identifiers that will help meet those internal business cases and use cases, but we really need to emphasize the power of linking externally and the external use cases for actually uptake of externally unique, globally unique persistent identifiers to be able to link us. And I think that, you know, what we'll come to in the recommendations is the role of not just our project, but the role of the programme in saying that we need to also look towards our external use cases and not only our internal management use cases when we think about which persistent identifiers we might want to implement. And especially when it comes to understanding, I guess, the overheads of those implementations as well. So coming on to the recommendations, we have a set of 6 recommendations that are really things that we will either completely do or start to take forward within the time frame of what we've got left in the project, which is about 10 months, I think. And then we have a set of 3 recommendations that really kind of have to fall beyond the scope of the project because of the timing of this or because of the scale that we need to push that at. So in terms of our first 6 kind of project focused recommendations and what we will take further, it is really about addressing that value proposition, articulating the benefits specifically to decision makers. We also, in terms of point 2, need to set out the requirements that GLAM organisations have understand them and map them to the features and types of persistent identifiers that are available to us, and kind of draw up an accompanying roadmap that helps organizations take the first step, either to using persistent identifiers because they're not currently using anything, or actually saying we have a set of identifiers, but they're not necessarily these kind of gold standard ones. What are the steps we need to take to move us along towards something that is, for instance, actionable, machine actionable, rather than just a kind of a static string of numbers. We also want to look at how we can start the dialogue with system vendors. So as organizations, very few of us, I think, if any at all, have software and infrastructure that we use to manage our collections that has been hand-built internally. So what we want to make sure is that as we replace existing systems or as we upgrade existing systems, that the vendors that we work with make sure that they support the persistent identifiers that we need to be able to link our data across our institutions. We have been working with colleagues in the Netherlands who have actually already had some success in working with the system vendors that they use within their country, and we're talking to them about, you know, how those conversations went and how we can also enable those conversations with UK-based vendors or the vendors that we use in the UK. We really need to understand costs, and that's one of the things that we put in the proposal to kind of give a better idea of what the costs of implementing persistent identifiers are. Full kind of real workflow life cycle cost modeling is going to be difficult within the time frame that we have. But I think what we want to do is get as much data and continue to collect the data about the costs, so that could be part of the cost benefit analysis, essentially, that organizations will want to do to make their business cases. We talk a lot about moving towards implementation, but for those organizations that have already implemented persistent identifiers, they need to get them used. So we're providing additional guidance to staff working across the sector for their users that they can pass on to their users about how to cite our collections with the use of persistent identifiers. This is really core to the benefits of metrics. So if our users aren't using the persistent identifiers that we give them and have spent money implementing to cite the material, we're not going to be able to use them for metrics. So it's kind of the other side of the coin in terms of realizing the benefits of implementation. And then what we want to do, still within the time frame of the project, is really start the conversation about sector-wide governance. So if we're all deciding to do something a little bit different from each other across the sector, we won't fully realize the benefits of persistent identifier implementation. So we want to make sure that those conversations are started about what sector-wide governance might look like, whether it is just a rationalization of policies, for instance, which leads us into the kind of post-project or beyond the project recommendations that we have. And one of the things we do want people to start looking at is their own institutional policies around persistent identifiers. So in order to really demonstrate commitment to the use of something that is supposed to be persistent, that is supposed to be an identifier that lives alongside our collections for their entire lifetime and life cycle, we need to make sure that there is that organizational commitment through policies or public statements and commitments. The BNF, so the French National Library, released their persistent identifier policy just a couple of weeks ago. We are working on one within the British Library. And what we will do is kind of share that so that people can look at the direction we're going in and hopefully be able to learn from our policy and adopt similar policies of their own. Number 8, in terms of our recommendations, acknowledges that the community, the heritage sector generally contains large-scale organisations such as ourselves at the British Library with, you know, masses of collection material, millions and millions of items, with strategic systems that in order to manage that, we can't necessarily tinker with them or retrofit them very easily for support of persistent identifiers. They are big ships to turn around. Equally, we have organisations in the sector have little or no infrastructure support or technology support. And we need to look at ways that we can make sure that organisations across those kind of two ends of the scale are able to work with persistent identifiers. So whether that's lightweight middleware that can sit alongside large, hard to change strategic systems, or whether it's a shared infrastructure approach for smaller heritage organisations with no technical capacity. And finally, again, number 9 just reiterates that the approach to all of these kind of needs to be done with, you know, a sector-wide approach and sector-wide government. And, you know, really this is a call to commit to adoption and integration of persistent identifiers for those with the opportunity to do so right now, so that we can continue to understand the benefits, the use, the cost, the value, and work towards an approach that will work for all kinds of organisations within the sector, whether that's university heritage collections, private heritage collections, national heritage collections. You know, all the scales that we cover, with all the different types of workflows and management issues that we have. So those are our recommendations. What are we kind of doing now to move towards it? Well, I've mentioned so far that, you know, what we're trying to build essentially is a toolkit in support of institutional decision making. But once we produce those tools, we need people to actually pick them up and use them. So, you know, if we're producing guidance, please do pick it up and try and use it. I would say also give us feedback on what we've produced. If we are missing certain elements that you need to be able to make the case to your decision makers, or if you are the decision maker and you don't quite understand things, you know, please do feed that back to the project so we can make sure we're matching what we produce to what your needs are. We will have more events, more virtual events. We had really hoped to be able to hold a workshop specifically in Scotland, but that's looking less likely as we get towards the end of the project. But we'll continue to hold virtual events to be able to keep the dialogue going, to be able to continue to present what we're producing. And this is just a shout out, sorry, for pidforum.org. So this is a website set up in a completely separate project from this, but it is an online community for all people who are interested in any way in persistent identifiers, whether you're an expert struggling with a specific call to a PID provider to mint an identifier and you're not sure why you're getting error messages, to someone who just doesn't really know what this whole thing is and where they should care, who has a few questions for the community. All the folks on there are super friendly. We'll continue to engage with that community and push out information from our project on the pidforum.org. But anyone with an interest in learning more about persistent identifiers, we highly recommend going to pidforum.org, as well as coming to us with questions, because obviously we can try and answer your questions. And we're thinking about how we can better support, again, tools for decision making beyond just kind of static PDFs and leaflets that you can wave in front of people. The difficulty with that is obviously if we produced a PDF document within the project that you're able to go away and use for the first year after the project's finished, beyond that first year after our project's finished, it may rapidly go out of date. So we're thinking about how we can provide tools that we can keep up to date, but also that the community can kind of adopt and keep up to date beyond the lifetime of the project, and doing things potentially with GitHub. So we're just drafting those, and we will, one of our future workshops will very much be us kind of presenting what we've built, getting feedback, going away and seeing if we can improve it. And again, it's very much thinking about sustainability and who will adopt and support these decision-making tools once the project ends as well. And I think that is it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Can someone let me know you can hear me, because I think I was automatically muted. Yep, okay. That was fantastic, incredibly practical, useful and forward-looking, and I hope everyone on the call would agree that being able to communicate with the project while it's live and having really useful outputs from it afterwards is going to be incredibly helpful right across the sector. So thank you very much, Rachel. She'll be available for questions after Gethin. So Gethin, if you want to go ahead, please do.
Just share my screen. can you can you see that?
We're still seeing the reduced. Yep.
Yeah. Can we see that?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Okay, great. Well, lovely to see you all here. And thanks to Rachel for an excellent presentation. I think that many aspects of what I'm going to talk about do build on PIDs also. So I think the two are well aligned. So I'm going to talk to you today about locating a national collection, which we refer to as LaNC. It's a project that tries to help cultural heritage organisations to use location data, such as where objects were made and used, or the places they depict and describe, to connect collections and engage audiences. So through scoping, workshop, audience research, and exploratory technical work, the project will establish best practice and provide technical recommendations for a national approach to using location to discover cultural heritage collections. So these are the partners on the project. We have a mix really of institutions that are involved in heritage management, heritage site management, as well as a lot of institutions that derive a lot of income from visitors, heritage site visits, and as well as the University of Exeter, where we have the COI Leif Isaacson. We have COIs at the National Trust, Alex Hunt, and Anthony Musson at Historical Royal Palaces is our third COI. I'm the PI of the project. Lead curator for digital map collections at the British Library. And we also are we are blessed to have Valeria Vitali working on the project. I think she's on the call today, and you know, a great deal of the work today has been down to her, so much appreciated. Okay, so the project divides into engagement and infrastructure work packages. So the engagement work package focuses on the landscape of stakeholders, both cultural heritage organisations and public, and examines their values, motivations, and capabilities trying to ensure that project recommendations meet the needs of different audiences. On the other hand, the infrastructure work package focuses on technical implementation and the application of previous work, for example, the Pelagios methodology, to forging a national collection based on location. Now we are about, about approaching the halfway stage for our project, and to date the engagement work package has been the focus of our work, and so that's going to be pretty much the entire focus today, and I'll be presenting results of our research in that area. Firstly, based on a series of interviews we have conducted with representatives of cultural heritage organisations, and second, through an audience survey that we have conducted. And we're also going to then point to some next steps with focus groups that are just coming, that we're going to be holding very, very shortly. Now, as a self-confessed and indeed proud GIS nerd and former developer, you know, from my perspective, I'm definitely more comfortable on that technical side, the infrastructure work package. Yet, for various reasons, you know, I've become really quite involved in the engagement side of things, and I've found that really interesting. Actually, it's been great for me. So, I'll begin by describing some of the interviews, and then so we chose interviewees based on various criteria. Our sampling criteria were type of organization, basically, and role in organization. So in terms of type of organization, we included institutions from across the GLAM and heritage sector. We chose institutions of different sizes with different remits. So we chose local, regional and national institutions, as well as those at different stages of their digital development. And for within those institutions, we targeted individuals with two types of role. On the one hand, technical roles, so those with expertise in the acquisition, maintenance, sharing and delivery of cultural heritage data, including but not limited to location information. And secondly, others with a strategic role. So those are the individuals with expertise in managing and designing the public delivery of content on the web and elsewhere. And so we conducted 13 interviews with people in these roles. And the following findings are really not our own opinions, but really are amalgamations of what these different interviewees have talked about. And really what they felt was important to them and to their institutions. So the organizations divide into three types based on the importance of location to their work. So firstly, location is fundamental to the work of certain organizations, typically those managing the historic environment. They have a strong expertise often in GIS with institutional systems founded specifically on location, and their data is often held as coordinates alongside toponyms. But despite that use of coordinates, we still found that there was considerable heterogeneity within that location data there. Then, on the other hand, we have regional or national GLAM organizations. Here, metadata does contain substantial location information, but it doesn't occupy this role of priority within the institutions like it would do with those that manage sites. And therefore, location data is represented as toponyms, and it does again suffer from a lack of standardization. There's patchy coverage, and on the whole, we didn't find overwhelming use of authority files or standardized vocabularies there. And then finally, some of our interviewees were within institutions where much of their location information was actually held in non-digital formats, like card indexes. But that's not going to be the focus for us today. So many interviewees that we spoke to mentioned that location offered benefits and the other types of metadata did not. So in this regard, a range of motivations can act as a gateway between public audiences and locations, locations and collections. So the first motivation that came up time and time again was local identity. So audiences have a greater interest in items and stories around those items from the area where they live. A second motivation that again was discussed was proximity. So methods of bringing items associated with the user's current location, whether that's a trip, travel, a commute, whatever, was also discussed. And although our interviewees didn't really elaborate on this, we feel that that might be something associated with or that can be tapped into through, GPS-enabled mobile. And third was memory. So, for example, an interest in the locations where one or one's ancestors or friends have lived often motivates a search for historical information. One interviewee remarked how members of the public, especially older citizens, do show a strong interest in documenting changes to the natural and built environment that happened in their lifetime. So how can we build on these motivations to engage audiences? So a collection item can be connected to many possible locations. Examples include location of manufacture, where the item was exhibited, or what the item depicts. interviewees emphasized an interest in this diversity. And there was a lot of discussion around object biographies, particularly from interviewees in the museum sector. A few interviewees also discussed how connections between location and a collection item can vary in their depth or richness. And so to illustrate this variation, take this wonderful painting of John Clayton on the right. He was passionate about Roman history and bought sections of Hadrian's Wall, including Chester's Fort, which is managed by our project partner, English Heritage, as you can see on the left of the slide. Now, the painting of Clayton hangs in Wallington Hall, Northumberland today, which is managed by the National Trust. It portrays Clayton as a Roman centurion presiding over the wall's construction. Although the obvious connection here is its place of exhibit, which is Wallington Hall, the National Trust property, perhaps the more interesting connection is Chester's Fort. But an explanation of the relevance of the painting to Chester's Fort is required. And so establishing first, right, and then presenting the latter's rich connections require greater investment and curation. And so that's something we've come across from many, that's a sentiment that was expressed by many of our interviewees. You know, there was this interest in these rich connections. You know, myself coming from a technical background, I've been, you know, my thoughts had been in terms of establishing connections at scale, but our interviewees were definitely interested in these rich connections and how they are more rewarding and might foster interest amongst the wider audience. So how can the public access this information? Our interviewees had a lot of ideas here. Simplicity and user-friendliness were the overriding desires. Organizations mentioned a single place or access point to search using location and other terms to reproduce a Google-like experience. I mean, that just basic being able to search across their own collections was expressed often. And several subjects stressed the difficulty of doing this even within their own institution. Overall, we found that existing infrastructure was quite limited, with little use of structured data, such as linked open data for search engine optimization, or Gazetteer's location-based authority files like geonames for standardization. So that was existing infrastructure that makes location information accessible outside their own institution for purposes of crawling or harvesting. So our interviewees also considered user journeys very carefully, and several subjects described a two-way interaction with location information. So on the one hand, being able to look for a particular location and discover all the related items, or on the other hand, to look at an item and discover all the related locations. And so according to one interviewee, institutions shouldn't try to put everything on one page, but I quote, to link other material, creating a Wikipedia effect that makes you feel that you can explore further. And that was, that requirement, or that need to not present too much information at once, but allow exploration of information, was something that was picked up by quite a few interviewees. And in this regard, the need to show a user what they were about to click through and see in the form of a preview or like a thumbnail was something that was mentioned. And such a preview might be useful within an individual system, but also on social media. So, so the link would produce this preview. And so there were also some interesting ideas regarding how this might be expressed in practical terms. So dynamic web maps were an obvious choice. Imagining a web map based interface, you know, we're all familiar with this, points on the map, but and methods of filtering. Time was a useful filtering category, and our interviewees at HES, at Historic Environment Scotland, mentioned that just a simple feature that says what something is and how old it is, like looking at the record of an abandoned farmstead, and knowing this was used at the time of Mary Queen of Scots was highly desirable. And so again, my kind of background would suggest, when we're looking at temporal information, that, you know, quantitative approach is useful, but there's this need to try and structure data according to the requirements or interests of the audience, and that came through from our interviewees. Other approaches included narrative, spatial narratives were mentioned, and also, you know, location-based crowdsourcing or user-generated content. Okay, so I'm now going to move on to the audience survey work, which has been the second part of our the engagement work package. Here we have examined the public, and we've examined attitudes. We've examined attitudes to cultural heritage, the confidence with and use of digital technologies, and values and their relation to place and geography on the one hand, and on the other hand, we've also looked at location-based interfaces. So those are looking at use cases, features, and the structure of data. And this has essentially been focused on a public audience and their experiences online. And so in order to do this, we've worked with the National Trust, and, you know, Alex Hunt from the National Trust has led this work, and he's worked on this in conjunction with Valeria. And they have worked alongside Research Pods, which are a market research company who have delivered results using the National Trust's Our Place online audience platform. So the public survey work is divided into two parts, which Research Pods are organizing. And the first is a quantitative survey, and the second is qualitative focus group interviews. So qualitative work is ongoing at present, and I'll discuss some of the direction we're taking with that at the end. But first, we'll go through some of the results of the quantitative work, which we've conducted with 992 members of the general public who completed a survey of 15 minutes in length. So the 992 are representative of the UK population on age, gender, and location, and were selected from a larger initial group as they had some interest in heritage. The primary purpose of the survey is to determine the composition of these focus groups and to explore topics and questions to be covered therein. However, the results are also interesting in their own right and can offer insights, but these have to be confirmed at the focus group stage, as we are, you know, although it's a large sample, we have to be careful about how representative it is. So the initial stage of the survey sketched out motivations and capabilities of our sample. Now, in terms of interest in heritage or attitudes towards cultural heritage, call me cynical, but I was surprised at the level of interest there was amongst our respondents. Only 8% of the larger group that I mentioned earlier were not at all interested in heritage and were therefore screened out. Second, in technical confidence. Again, I was actually surprised that several pieces of information demonstrate a really high level of technical confidence amongst those surveyed. 92% strongly or quite agreed that they felt confident searching for and finding what they want online, whilst 80% quite or really enjoyed using map services. And so this slide depicts how often people use online tools. We can see that 98% have some familiarity with online map services, while 65% use map services at least once a week. So I mean that's all very, very, very positive and very encouraging. You know, the maps are not as popular as video or search, but they are widely used all the same. Now we look at, we went on to look at values, and in terms of values, we wanted to gain insights into people's relationship with the idea of place. So we Here we asked people about their attitudes towards place in their local area first, and 60% identified strongly with the place in local area that they consider to be their home, whilst 54% agree that they feel well connected to the local community or place in the place and local area that they now consider to be their home. On the other hand, 75% agree that they enjoy a visit more if they can find out information about the history of the place, and 83% agree they're always curious to find out more about the places that they visit. So I find this really interesting as to think through, and it demonstrates there might be two different routes into this work. On the one hand, we have this local perspective. Although the majority of people identify with their local area, a very significant minority do not. And studies have shown that much of the UK's population do feel rootless. And what does the 60% figure tell us? Does it mean that those who do not identify with their local area are uninterested? Or do we actually have an opportunity here to build a sense of local identity through cultural heritage? And so these are aspects we're trying to examine in focus groups. Similarly, on the other hand, curiosity about new places might be an even bigger motivation. And I suppose here we're not just referring to proximity, as interviewees suggested, but also, this browsing, exploring, or planning trips, or also looking at when you get home from a trip or a holiday, looking in more detail at what you've experienced. So the broad headlines here seem very positive for TaNC and for location-based interfaces, with a lot of enthusiasm out there. Now, despite this interest, awareness of existing resources was quite low. So 38% were aware of map functions on heritage and history and websites, 27% had actually used these functions, but then 85% had enjoyed using them, which was very high if compared to other areas, other types of online services. So we might conclude from this that appealing services are failing to reach potential audiences. And I feel this is a key early finding for us. In terms of public engagement, while we could focus on the interface and the data, promotion and visibility of online outputs of discovery projects, and indeed our own prototype are critical, and clear communication that the interface exists, but also what it can be used to achieve, as we saw with the kind of preview that I mentioned earlier, are perhaps are also very important alongside things like interface design, data structure. So our survey examined different communication channels across several questions. This list is by no means comprehensive, but I'm just going to highlight a couple of areas where we found some interesting answers. So yeah, so we had quite a few different questions that dealt with these communication methods. One thing that stuck out to me was local media. 61% of our respondents tended to find information about their local area from websites, local websites. Now, I understand here we're talking about online community forums, social media, virtual notice boards, or local blogs. And although we put the term local websites in the survey, this has been a bit of a surprise to me, and I'm not absolutely sure what these are. So we're looking to explore this further and discussing this with the UK Web Archive as well. Similarly, 45% used local newspapers to find information, and 31% used leaflets or magazines that were locally produced. So that's an area we're looking to explore in the focus groups, as well as some of these more these other channels that are more commonly mentioned. So understanding these communication channels does again raise interesting questions for digital cultural heritage resources. Is it enough to build these resources and expect people to come, or are these resources products? And do we need to look at things, user needs assessment, pathways to market, etc. Now, turning to access interfaces, and which is the part I must admit I feel most comfortable with here. we have already established that amongst our sample, there was a strong awareness and use of web maps, but how are they used? So task-oriented approaches dominate here, with common uses being navigation and information retrieval. And those are colored black on the slide here. Tasks include planning and scheduling trips, wayfinding and obtaining basic information such as opening hours. Although there is a familiarity with using web maps to complete these tasks, the public are not so familiar with curiosity or exploratory tasks. And colored turquoise here. But last year, I think, there's been a lot of success with data journalism, such as, particular election maps you might all be familiar with, or the runaway success of Johns Hopkins University's COVID-19 map, which I must say is now an ubiquitous slide amongst digital mapping presentations. These demonstrate a public appetite for exploring, interpreting, and learning from maps. And 40% of our sample had used such maps. A related use case is a discovery tool. 69% of the sample do click on links to external sites some of the time. And so the public are familiar with using maps as a gateway to other web pages. Such maps can offer a generous interface and a move beyond a hard text search box. Opportunities for playful engagement might improve the frequency of use, providing a hook to entice users to return to these resources. But what really is as yet unproven is whether in the wider population, competence in using these dynamic web maps for these utilitarian tasks like planning a journey will transfer or translate to exploring cultural heritage objects of interest as a kind of recreational activity. And again, that's something we're going to look at in the qualitative work. So the information presented from our survey provides an overall context. Next, we will go on to gain deeper insights from a second round of focus group interviews. So the aim of these extended video sessions is to understand how the public connect history and location and to explore potential technologies. How can place bring collections to life? By returning to the motivations our interviewees raised, local values, proximity and memory, we seek to ultimately understand identity and heritage. This slide illustrates some simple location-based interface concepts, and we're going to take some of these and use them as prototypes, with apologies for the market speak there. But these are simple sketches, like a PowerPoint slide, that will present to the focus groups and ask them questions about what they would do here, what they would search for, what they would expect to see. And to be honest, the prototypes might be more simple than the ones we see on the screen here. However, I would also say that in this initial work, I'm told that having 25% of people feeling that these location-based online concepts are a good idea is actually a very positive sign. Now, to explore these ideas in the focus groups, we are clustering respondents into several possible profiles. Individuals are assigned profiles based on their answers to survey questions, and we've along two axes: their interest in cultural heritage and their technological competence. And the focus of the exercise is under discussion at the moment, but I think we're looking at understanding how to engage this core group, which is C on the slide. Those score a medium value on both axes, and they are the next door neighbor group to those who are possibly the easiest to reach, which are those who have a high interest in heritage and a high technical competence. And in doing so, we hope to expand the reach of cultural heritage and to contrast the two groups in order to generate insight. So in summary, to date, the project has looked at the engagement side, but once we have looked at these focus groups, we're going to try to take the findings and correlate those with the quantitative work that we've already done to try and establish some general conclusions. We're then going to take that forward to our technical work package, where we are building a prototype interface, and we'll look to put together some concrete recommendations for the way that cultural heritage access interfaces in general are produced, but also specifically those that are based on location. Now, this prototype will be, we're producing that towards the end of the summer, and we hope to be able to share that with you soon. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Gethin. It's very pleasing to me, at least, to hear a proud GIS nerd being turned on to public engagement. And I think your presentation made that really clear. That was really fascinating results there. So we're going to open this up to questions now. Just a reminder, if you're on the Zoom call and you want to ask a question, just put a Q in the chat and I'll call upon you to turn on your camera and mic. Camera's optional if you've got dodgy connection, and to ask your question of either speaker. And if you're watching us on the live streaming, then put it in the comment function there and Colin will translate it for us. You won't unfortunately be able to deliver it live. So would anyone like to start with a question to either of our speakers? Just stick a Q in the chat and I'll call you. Yes, Elizabeth Corey-Pierce, please go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I haven't turned my camera on. I had a question just for Gethin, and sorry.
Aha.
I was just fiddling around my camera. My question was, thank you, this is fascinating, really fascinating. I'm an anthropologist, I work with ethnology collections, so I'm really interested in the scope of what you're doing for other collections that are disconnected from their originating communities. So I work in New Zealand, but the collections from that tribal group are everywhere and I'm mapping them. So my question was, when you were doing the research that you mentioned with, sorry, my question was that you mentioned the qualitative research and with yourself and research boards, and you listed age, gender, and something else, but my concern was that in your that you didn't look at cultural diversity of the group. So whose heritage, whose history, the age, gender, those divisions are all very important. But I thought that ethnic and cultural diversity should also be in there.
Yes. So the group were recruited based on those three demographic categories. But within that, there is also a diversity of ethnicities. And in the focus group stage, we are ensuring that within every focus group, there are that diversity is reflected.
Okay, I guess I didn't mean it as diversity of the focus group. I meant it as to not have blind spots in our categories. So okay, so I'll give an example. When you have a museum collection, things tend to be ordered by who the collector was, rather than the place of origin. So just the whole concepts that we're using become skewed by that.
Yes. So so in terms of the relationship between location and place, so we can look at space in terms of coordinates, or we can look at place in terms of a constructed identity. So and a constructed entity, and therefore when we're presenting place through visualizations, we have to be quite careful in terms of boundaries, in terms of uncertainty, in terms of aggregating and aggregating entities from different that may be quite diverse and a reductive tendency to bring those together. And so when we're in our technical in the technical work package, we will be looking at those kind of visualization techniques and how those apply to kind of, our own concepts of place. Yes.
Okay, thank you both.
Okay, thank you.
Tim Boone, do you want to come in?
Hi, yes, thanks. Fascinating presentations. A question in complete ignorance to Rachel about PIDs and how they might relate to the museum sector. When you're talking about a persistent identifier, are you talking about those for example, for a particular title of a particular book or a particular edition? And does that extend to individual objects in museum collections? I mean, could Stephenson's rocket have a PID, in which case what form would that take? Or could a particular, I know, vacuum cleaner in a social history collection have a PID? So I just want to understand a little bit more about what level these PIDs are at.
So really, those decisions would be based on how you want to link and manage your collections. So certainly it would be possible to apply persistent identifiers to all those concepts and entities. So within the library community, you know, we have this concept of a work. So let's say you have A Tale of Two Cities, for instance. That kind of applies to the work in all its manifestations. And then you would have, for instance, a first edition copy that the British Library might have would have its own identifier, but a first edition copy that National Library of Scotland has might have a different identifier. We might have, you know, a manuscript with author comments on the side that also would potentially deserve its own identifier. And really the decision comes down to how you're using each of those items and how you wish to link them beyond our institutional boundaries. So you might want to use the persistent identifier for the concept, the work as an umbrella, and to link that off to all the other different instances that are held within various organisations across the UK or the sector, for instance. So yes, you could apply identifiers at all those levels. You could then also have identifiers for Charles Dickens, for instance, for the author, potentially for the publisher. So you could go down to various different kind of levels and granularities, as well as thinking about identifiers with different versions as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Richard Light.
Hi, also, or to follow up from Tim's question, actually, for Rachel, I've been involved with the cataloguing system for smaller museums, the MODE system, and we have 650 users. I did actually implement a linked data framework for MODE users, which almost none of them are using, but in principle, we'd be very interested in actually implementing whatever guidelines come out of this project. So I'm wondering to what extent you would expect to actually come up with, you know, specific metadata standards or, you know, information that could be delivered. And if you were able to do that, then we would be very interested in making that happen. But again, as I say, a lot of the smaller museums have the sort of resource issues that you mentioned in your talk. And so it would be really interesting to talk through how we might actually resolve those sorts of challenges as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Richard. We would definitely be interested in having that conversation with you. I think that's also where this looking at how a sector-wide approach or sector-wide governance towards this issue would be helpful. You know, hopefully if we could have those conversations and get large swathes of the sector moving, that actually will be able to carry the smaller organizations with us. I think in terms of very specific requirements, we will have relatively broad requirements, which we hope will be easily adoptable by large numbers of organizations. But, you know, similar to my answer to Tim's question, there will always be requirements that might be institutional led. There might, you know, be a smaller number of institutions that have certain workflows or certain processes that they need to make, and we need to have those in consideration. But yes, we'd certainly be interested in working with you on what some of those more widely applicable requirements might be.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Nikki Nicholson.
Hello. Yeah, they were both great presentations. Thanks very much. My question's for Rachel, and it's about how PIDs support citation. So am I right in thinking there's still some work to do in finding where citations of persistent identifiers have occurred within the literature? Because I think sometimes PIDs are kind of perhaps a little oversold in that people think automatically they're going to get a ton of metrics, but those citations need to be detected. And is there scope for sharing those detection tasks within a project like TaNC?
I'm not sure about the question on sharing the detection tasks. We could certainly look at that as part of the, again, what will further next steps be beyond the project. It will very much depend on which persistent identifiers people pick up and use. So with things like digital object identifiers, because they've been used in the publishing industry for such a long time now, they have developed ways of automatically detecting where they're picked up elsewhere. But one of the key things about the global uniqueness aspect of persistent identifiers is that if it's truly globally unique, if you pop that into a search engine, whichever search engine of your choice, if someone has cited and mentioned your item with that identifier, you will pick up those mentions and they will not be confused with anything else that someone will be talking about. So obviously that's not automated, but again, it's one of those things about the selection of persistent identifiers. And if metrics is the thing that's super important to you, then, you know, we would recommend going down the route of using something like a digital object identifier, because the organizations that provide those and work with digital object identifiers are starting to put those tools in place for automated detection. But obviously then there is a kind of a cost associated with using digital object identifiers. So it's about your requirements versus the cost of implementation again, essentially.
Okay, thank you. Sally Foster.
Thanks, Rebecca. This is a question for Gethin. My ears really pricked up when you talked about how rich connections can be more rewarding, and you alluded to object biographies and a particular being an interest in that coming from museums. You used the example of Hadrian's Wall and the idea of linking a place and a painting. That was your particular example. And you said, well, that link requires an explanation. So all these things that we're talking about, they're about the link, but my question relates to how we add meaning to those links, because that's what an explanation is. And those meanings add up to our understanding, which is ultimately our biographies of things and people and places. So I wondered whether from your research to date, you had any sense of, was there more discussion about that, or any sense of how that might be taken forward?
Yes. So, you know, we've been doing a lot of work with, I mean, thanks, that's a really fascinating question. Yeah, and something that I've been thinking through quite a lot, you know. We've been doing a lot of work with the with Plagios. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they've been doing work in classics to create links between different types of research outputs or objects of research study, you know, like coins or inscriptions or articles and place. And their approach is just to have a very, you know, if we're thinking about this as a predicate in terms of like linked to open data, you know, just a very simple predicate. Everything is linked to that same place and in the same way. You know, but and initially that was, you know, that's my kind of way of thinking. But as we've explored this, it does seem that the type of link is quite important, both on the audience side and to and on the cultural heritage institution side. And how to present that is something that we're going to look at, how to create these links first through through curation, but also then how to present that without having without having a huge chunk of text, as like I just said, in terms of the paintings connection to the two different locations. And so trying to think through ways that we might present that is something we're going to move towards. But I think I'm not sure if I've actually answered your question very well, but and it's still a work in progress. But I think what has been clear is these richer links from the work that we've done. It seems that these richer links can engage a broader audience. The kind of Pelagios link I talked about, which is just a simple link. If I'm a researcher interested in that very specific place, I might be interested in a very wide range of sources about that place. But if I'm someone who doesn't live there, if I'm someone that has no connection to that place, it's those richer links that might bring something to life.
Okay, thank you. Mike Howe.
Hi, I've got a question for Rachel on use of permanent PIDs in natural history collections, and in particular, my own background is in geological collections. Now, we've had permanent identifiers, you could say, for 170 years, generally known as registration numbers. The advantage is that they are, I guess, human resolvable. If you see a registration number, it will mean quite a bit probably to the curator responsible. And we're working with IGSN. We are the local issuing agents for the UK. And we've recognized the value of registration numbers in terms of the UK. If we simply prefix existing numbers with UK and then a dot and the MDA code, which is a well-established thing, we'll end up with what is a globally unique number. And I'm really asking, do you think that it helps if you have developed a system of PIDs that's based on existing museum registration numbers? Is it more likely to be taken up by smaller museums with fewer resources? Because it does have the advantage that those numbers are much more likely to be human resolvable than some of the kind of pseudo-random numbers you get with computer-generated PIDs.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That would make it easier. So there is absolutely the ability to plug existing identifiers, whether that's some kind of internal accession number or system number that curators are already familiar with, into systems which then make it essentially globally unique and actionable, with the addition of, as you mentioned, a kind of prefix, or essentially tacking that existing identifier into something like a DOI, popping it on the end, or something like an ARC identifier, which if you don't know what that is, you can see our BL case study for a little bit more information. But you're right, I think that also enhances the kind of backwards compatibility, if you like. So in an automated fashion, you might be able to update all your digital records to turn those into globally unique actionable identifiers, but actually you can't then necessarily go through and change all the labels on your physical items. Whereas if you know all you have to do is apply a certain string at the beginning to turn that into a URL, and you'll be able to access the digital information about that. Obviously that makes it a lot easier, and you don't have to have someone to go through and change all your physical labels. So I think there are many advantages to taking the approach that you mentioned that people are taking around IGSN, which itself is actionable through digital object identifiers, DOIs, and reusing existing identifiers and appending them to a new scheme.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Carlotta in a moment, but if any of those watching on the YouTube live stream wish to make a question, then just annotate it on YouTube and Colin will pass it to the group. Carlotta.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you both, because I think they were very representative presentation of what TaNC is trying to do. And so thank you for spreading what we're trying to achieve in these 5 years. And my question, I think, goes back to what Sally Foster was saying. And so about, you both emphasize this idea of the external aspect of your project. So not just what will help organizations to connect collections and link collections, but I'm more interested in this case in how do you envision your project will help or will offer new research pathways or new research trajectories through what you're proposing. So do you think that your system would allow for different research through the kind of linking that you're proposing?
Who'd like to go first? Yep, Gethin.
I can go first. Yes, so maps can be, as I see it, maps, I mean, plenty disagree with me, but as I see it, maps can be used for two distinct purposes. When talking about dynamic web maps. On the one hand, we can use them as a tool for discovery. And through, in that regard, through co-contextualization of diverse collections, researchers can discover new items about a particular place of interest, and that can add to the grand total of their knowledge. For example, I wrote my PhD on a mountain range. When I was researching that mountain range, I was interested in the geology, the pedology, hydrology, everything about that mountain range, and I found it very difficult to get to those resources. And so actually presenting them together would have improved the quality of my research. But that is using the map as a tool, as a gateway to click through to a collection. On the other hand, there's the opportunity to use a map as an interpretative model. And in that case, we are actually looking at patterns on the maps, for example, and trying to notice new patterns through the spatial distribution on the map, and from that visual interpretation, actually build insights. Now, in terms of cultural heritage collections, that's quite a difficult use case to fulfill, because as the earlier questioner as the earlier questioner mentioned, the type of connection. The other earlier question mentioned the type of place, the kind of what does the actual cultural heritage collection represent in terms of what's missing, how is it actually defined. And so I would see it more that I would see this location-based approach more on that discovery side than on that interpretative side.
Rachel, do you want to have a go at this one?
Thank you. Yeah, and I think I'd like to emphasize the point Gethin just made about understanding what's missing. So if we're able to connect up our collections, literally kind of join one piece of information in one organization with another across authors, creators, publishers, items, and places of production and where things have ended up, actually, one of the things you can do with persistent identifiers is then create a kind of knowledge map or a knowledge graph showing how all those points connect to each other. And actually, when you start to see how things connect, you can also then potentially identify what might be missing. So it might be that the items aren't missing from our collections, but actually we haven't described them in enough detail to be able to connect them into that knowledge graph. And I think identifying what's missing, actually missing, or where descriptions are missing is a potential outcome of us putting identifiers in place. I think discovery, again, through that knowledge graph is also really important, especially if we think about the highly unique collections that some of our smaller institutions across the sector hold as well. So the example I gave earlier was things like, a well-known published book such as Tale of Two Cities. Actually, institutions might have very specific and unique instances of items that might be relatively common across the sector. And as a researcher, if you were just putting in the name of something to try and find that, you would get all the kind of popular common common or garden versions of that object potentially, rather than the unique instances that smaller institutions might have. So I think being able to make more of our super unique collections and really place them in the center of some of those knowledge graphs is also a potential positive outcome of increased use of persistent identifiers.
Great, thank you both.
Thanks.
Anthony, I've made you wait, but Anthony first, do you want to come in?
Thanks very much. So, absolutely fascinating discussion. I think my question's quite obvious. Are you going to look at PIDs for places and locations? And how are you going to address issues of granularity and the nesting, both in terms of places, if those are toponyms, and locations, if they're coordinates? So I think it's a fascinating idea. Really interested to hear how you might be thinking about that. Thank you.
So one of the planned pieces of work we always had was to cooperate and integrate with the other foundation projects. And so obviously places and persistent identifiers for places was definitely one of those. We haven't had that in-depth conversation yet, but it will be happening in the second half of our project. But equally, you know, we want to also integrate with things like Heritage Connector. So being a linked data related project, there's obvious links for us there, with IIIF as well, and the increased use of persistent identifiers in IIIF. But also, I think one of the bullet points that we have in our proposal that we haven't gone into much detail yet and are aiming to within the next year is also, and I think slightly relates to one of the questions earlier, about understanding when we as organizations put an identifier on something, are we giving it an identity? And the communities that those collections have come out from or were produced by, we need to consider their thoughts on identity of items as well. So that's something that we kind of have to be slightly careful about when we're talking about identifiers and identity as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got a couple of minutes left. I've got no one else asking to ask a question. Carlotta can come back in if we haven't got anyone, but is there anyone out there who wants to ask something? Okay, Carlotta, looks like the last question is with you.
So I was thinking of a more philosophical question, or maybe even more egoistic one. So you both spoke of standards and sort of moving towards a standardization. Do you think that's the key for a unified national collection, moving towards standards and having collections of different scales following these standards, or is it just too complicated?
Go on, Gethin.
Well, I think if we look at the example, I mean, and this is speaking also to Anthony's question, I think if we look at the example of the Open Geospatial Consortium, there is an incredibly well-defined and well-used set of standards throughout industry, and that is embedded in, you know, embedded basically throughout global life today. And those have emerged over 30 years. And I think if we look at, you know, the use of geospatial technologies around us today, from the Internet of Things to web maps to GPS, we can see the value that can be derived from such a set of standards.
Rachel?
Yeah, I think I was just going to say it is about the value and the drivers that we each have as organizations. So people will adopt standards if it makes, you know, some part of their life fundamentally easier or gives them much greater value back than the investment they've put into something. And I think that because we are a diverse community, sometimes, you know, our requirements, our drivers don't necessarily always match up. And I think that's why it will be hard to say, you know, here are the 3 standards that we will all adopt, when actually we have different reasons for adopting them or not. And I think that's why I talked in our presentation about common approaches rather than kind of a small subset of fixed standards. I think common approaches might be a slightly easier first step to make. That's not to say that we wouldn't want to, you know, if AHRC or DCMS turned around and said, you will do this, I'm sure we will all look at how we will do something. But that being missing, I think common approaches is an easier first step to make.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Most particularly, of course, our two speakers. Thank you so much for kicking off our webinar series so well, and for everyone who participated, particularly for your questions and comments in the chat. As I said at the beginning, this is the first of 3 webinars looking at 6 out of 8 of our foundation projects. Colin's just put in the chat the details of the next 2 and signing up information. And you'd be very, very welcome to rejoin us next Monday and Wednesday afternoons to hear about another 4 of our projects. So thank you again to our speakers. Thank you for everyone for coming, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Please go and enjoy your lunch. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
I just shut them out.
Oh no, sorry, David. I only just got to your message. So yeah, it probably is quite useful. I mean, it's good. It's sort of polite to let people leave themselves, but yes. Well done, everybody. We lost our speakers, so we can't thank them. But that went very smoothly. Yeah.
Yep. It seemed to go okay. Yeah, I think YouTube would have less people, but had more in the Zoom one, which was good.
Yeah, I mean, presumably there was no reason for people to watch live, really, when they could have been in the, yeah.
It was interesting though, one person at the start commented on YouTube who had registered for this, so I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
I know. I think some places like the British Library maybe have a thing with Zoom. They're not really allowed.
Right.
It's a bit like Hays officially, I think, in the past.
Yeah, you can join Zoom things. It's just who's not supposed to have an account. So yeah, okay. And I got a pretty steady attendance of 97. We didn't seem to drop. It wasn't that people only came for one presentation. It seemed pretty steady, and lots of nice comments at the end. I think that format worked really well. You know, just 2 presentations that actually have a bit of meat. And
I just realised we're still live streaming. Just saw my face appear on YouTube.